The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Ravenscroft Palace as Queen Consort Helena made her way through the East Wing corridors. Her silk gown rustled against the ancient stone walls, each step echoing with purpose and barely contained frustration. The palace staff had learned to recognize that particular sound, the sharp click of her heels that meant someone was about to face the royal wrath. Princess Charlotte, barely 8 years old, had been discovered in the palace library again, her small fingers tracing the gilt edges of books far too advanced for her age. The child had a curious mind that often led her into trouble, much to Helena's dismay. Today's transgression involved ancient texts about the kingdom's founding, materials that Helena deemed entirely inappropriate for young eyes. The queen consort's jaw tightened as she recalled the morning's events. She had specifically instructed the child to remain in her chambers until the royal tutors arrived for morning lessons. Instead, Charlotte had somehow slipped past her governess and made her way to the restricted sections of the library. This defiance could not stand, not when the kingdom's stability depended on proper royal protocol being maintained at all times. Guard Captain Marcus Thornfield stood at attention near the throne room entrance, his ceremonial sword gleaming at his side. 20 years of service had taught him to read the subtle signs of palace politics, and today the air seemed particularly charged. The recent tensions between the queen consort and the young princess had not gone unnoticed by the palace staff, though few dared speak of it openly. Helena's voice cut through the morning stillness as she summoned a nearby servant. "Bring Princess Charlotte to the blue drawing room immediately, and ensure she understands this is not a request." The servant bowed quickly and hurried away, leaving Helena alone with her thoughts and growing irritation. The queen consort had married into the Ravenscroft dynasty barely 2 years ago, following the untimely death of the beloved Queen Isabella. The transition had been difficult for everyone, particularly young Charlotte, who struggled to accept Helena's authority. The child's stubborn streak reminded Helena painfully of her late mother, a comparison that never failed to stoke her anger. As Helena waited in the drawing room, she paced before the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens. The weight of her crown felt heavier today, the burden of maintaining royal dignity in the face of constant challenges, exhausting her patience. She had worked too hard to secure her position, to allow a child's defiance to undermine her authority. The sound of approaching footsteps drew her attention. Charlotte appeared in the doorway, her governess, Mrs. Pemberton, hovering anxiously behind her. The child's dark hair was slightly disheveled, and there were ink stains on her fingers from her morning reading. She looked small and vulnerable standing in the grand doorway, but Helena steeled herself against any sympathy. "Princess Charlotte," Helena began, her voice cold and formal. "Your behavior this morning was entirely unacceptable. When I give you instructions, I expect them to be followed without question. Do you understand me?" The child nodded silently, her large eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and defiance that only served to fuel Helena's frustration further. The confrontation escalated quickly as Helena detailed Charlotte's failures and shortcomings, her voice growing sharper with each word. The child's governess shifted uncomfortably, clearly torn between loyalty to her young charge and fear of the queen consort's displeasure. The tension in the room became almost unbearable as Helena's criticism grew more personal and harsh. Pemberton finally stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly. "Your Majesty, perhaps we might discuss Princess Charlotte's education privately? The child has been through so much change recently." Her words trailed off as Helena's cold stare turned toward her, the temperature in the room seeming to drop several degrees. "Mrs. Pemberton, you are dismissed." "I will handle Princess Charlotte's education myself from now on," Helena declared, her tone brooking no argument. The governess hesitated for a moment, glancing worriedly at Charlotte, before reluctantly curtsying and backing out of the room. The child was now alone with her stepmother, and the isolation seemed to press down upon them both. Helena moved closer to Charlotte, her presence looming over the small figure. "You will learn respect, one way or another," she said quietly, her voice carrying an undercurrent of threat that made the child step backward involuntarily. "Your mother may have indulged your willful nature, but I will not. You are a princess of Ravenscroft, and you will behave accordingly." The morning light streaming through the windows seemed to dim as Helena reached for Charlotte's arm, her grip firm and unyielding. The child's eyes widened with fear as she realized the severity of her situation. The palace walls seemed to close in around them as Helena began to pull Charlotte toward the door, her intentions unclear but undeniably ominous. Outside in the corridor, the usual bustle of palace life continued unaware. Servants went about their duties, guards maintained their posts, and the kingdom operated as it always had. But within the blue drawing room, a drama was unfolding that would soon ripple through the ancient halls of Ravenscroft Palace, setting in motion events that would change everything for the royal family. The sound of Charlotte's small voice, raised in protest, began to echo through the corridors as Helena dragged her from the room. The child's pleas grew more desperate as they moved through the palace, but Helena's grip remained firm, her determination unwavering. The confrontation that had begun as a simple disciplinary action was rapidly escalating into something far more serious. Palace staff began to take notice as the queen consort marched through the halls with the struggling princess in tow. Whispers followed in their wake, and several servants exchanged worried glances. The sight was deeply troubling to those who had served the royal family for years and remembered the gentle nature of the late Queen Isabella. Captain Thornfield, making his routine patrol of the palace grounds, heard the commotion from the main corridor. His trained ear immediately recognized the sound of distress, and his instincts as both a soldier and a protector of the royal family kicked in. Something was very wrong, and his duty demanded investigation. As Helena and Charlotte approached the grand staircase leading to the upper chambers, the child's resistance grew more pronounced. Her small voice carried clearly through the marble halls, creating an uncomfortable scene that threatened to expose the growing dysfunction within the royal household. The very foundations of palace protocol were being tested by this increasingly public display. The morning that had begun with such promise for the kingdom was rapidly deteriorating into a crisis that would demand immediate attention. The ancient traditions and ceremonies of Ravenscroft Palace were built upon order and dignity, but both were now at risk as the conflict between stepmother and stepdaughter reached a dangerous crescendo. Captain Marcus Thornfield quickened his pace as the sounds of distress grew louder, his hand instinctively moving to rest on the pommel of his ceremonial sword. 20 years of military service had taught him to trust his instincts, and every fiber of his being now screamed that something was terribly wrong in the palace halls. The protocols he had sworn to uphold demanded the protection of all royal family members, regardless of age or station. The sight that greeted him as he rounded the corner into the main corridor stopped him cold. Queen Consort Helena was forcibly dragging Princess Charlotte across the polished marble floor, the child's small feet struggling to find purchase as she was pulled along against her will. Charlotte's face was streaked with tears, her voice breaking as she pleaded to be released. The scene was a violation of everything the palace stood for. Other members of the palace staff had gathered at a respectful distance, their faces masks of barely concealed horror and uncertainty. None dared intervene directly with the queen consort, but their body language spoke volumes about their distress at witnessing such treatment of the young princess. The rigid hierarchy of palace life left them powerless to act, trapped between duty and conscience. Helena's grip on Charlotte's arm was tight enough to leave marks, her knuckles white with the force of her hold. The child's protests had grown weaker as exhaustion and fear took their toll, but she continued to resist with the desperate strength that only pure terror could provide. Her small voice echoed off the ancient walls, a heartbreaking sound that seemed to awaken the very stones of the palace. "Please, stepmother Helena, you're hurting me." Charlotte's voice cracked with emotion as she stumbled along the corridor. Her plea fell on deaf ears as Helena maintained her determined march toward the upper levels of the palace. The queen consort's face was set in hard lines, her royal composure replaced by something far more troubling and unpredictable. Captain Thornfield's military training warred with palace protocol as he assessed the situation. His oath required him to protect the royal family from all threats. But what happened when one royal threatened another? The complexity of the situation demanded immediate action. But the consequences of choosing wrong could destroy his career and potentially endanger the kingdom's stability. The captain stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of his rank and years of service. "Your Majesty, is there perhaps some way I might be of assistance?" His words were carefully chosen, respectful yet probing, designed to de-escalate while gathering information. The other staff members seemed to hold their collective breath as they waited to see how the queen consort would respond. Helena paused in her march, her head turning slowly to fix Captain Thornfield with a cold stare. "Captain, this is a family matter. Princess Charlotte requires correction, and I intend to provide it. Your services are not needed here." Her tone was dismissive, but there was an edge of warning that suggested she would not tolerate interference with her intentions. Charlotte seized the momentary pause to look toward Captain Thornfield, with desperate hope in her eyes. "Captain Marcus, please help me," she whispered, her small voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. The plea struck the veteran soldier like a physical blow, activating every protective instinct he possessed, while simultaneously placing him in an impossible position. The captain's gaze moved between the queen consort and the princess, noting the fear in Charlotte's eyes and the iron determination in Helena's expression. His years of experience had taught him to read people quickly and accurately, and what he saw in Helena's demeanor raised every alarm bell in his mind. This was no longer about discipline or royal protocol. This was about power and control. "Your Majesty," Thornfield continued, his voice steady but firm, "perhaps Princess Charlotte would benefit from some time to compose herself before any further instruction. The child appears quite distressed." His words were diplomatic but carried an underlying message that he was prepared to stand his ground if necessary. Helena's grip on Charlotte's arm tightened visibly, causing the child to wince in pain. "Captain Thornfield, I am the queen consort of this realm, and I will not be questioned by a palace guard regarding the discipline of my stepdaughter. Stand aside immediately, or face the consequences of your insubordination." Her voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper that carried more threat than any shout. The gathered staff members began to shift nervously as the confrontation escalated. Several moved closer, drawn by concern for Princess Charlotte but restrained by their understanding of palace hierarchy. The tension in the corridor had reached a breaking point, with careers, relationships, and possibly lives hanging in the balance of the next few moments. Charlotte's struggles had weakened considerably, but she managed to raise her head long enough to mouth "Help me" to Captain Thornfield. The silent plea was more powerful than any spoken words, cutting through the captain's remaining hesitation and crystallizing his resolve. Some duties transcended rank and protocol, and protecting the innocent was the highest calling of any true soldier. The captain took another step forward, his bearing shifting subtly from diplomatic to authoritative. "Your Majesty, I must respectfully insist that Princess Charlotte be released immediately. Her distress is evident, and as captain of the palace guard, I cannot permit any harm to come to members of the royal family." His hand moved slightly closer to his sword hilt, not as a threat, but as a clear signal of his intentions. Helena's eyes flashed with rage at this open challenge to her authority. "How dare you presume to give me orders in my own palace? I am queen consort, and my word is law here. Princess Charlotte will receive the correction she deserves, and you will not interfere." Her voice rose sharply, echoing through the corridors and drawing even more attention to the unfolding crisis. The standoff between queen consort and captain stretched taut as a wire, with Princess Charlotte caught in the middle like a fragile bird between two predators. The ancient walls of Ravenscroft Palace had witnessed many dramatic moments throughout their history, but few had carried such potential for lasting damage to the royal family's reputation and stability. Other palace guards had begun to arrive, drawn by reports of the disturbance and the sound of raised voices. Their loyalty was divided between their queen consort and their captain, creating a volatile situation that could explode into something far worse if not handled with extreme care. The careful balance of power that kept the kingdom functioning was hanging by the thinnest of threads. Charlotte's soft sobbing provided a heartbreaking counterpoint to the harsh words being exchanged above her head. The child had become the center of a power struggle that would define the future of the royal family, her welfare seemingly secondary to the battle of wills between the adults who should have been protecting her. The morning sun continued to stream through the palace windows, illuminating a scene that would be remembered and discussed in whispered conversations for years to come. The convergence of duty, authority, and moral obligation had created a perfect storm within the normally peaceful halls of the palace, and the resolution would require someone to make a choice that would change everything. The tension in the palace corridor had reached a critical point as Captain Thornfield found himself caught between his sworn duty to the crown and his moral obligation to protect an innocent child. Helena's grip on Princess Charlotte had grown even tighter, and the young girl's whimpers of pain cut through the charged atmosphere like a blade. The assembled palace staff watched in horrified silence as their ordered world began to crumble before their eyes. Captain Thornfield's military instincts took over as he assessed the rapidly deteriorating situation. Helena's behavior had crossed the line from stern discipline into something far more dangerous, and Charlotte's obvious distress left no room for diplomatic solutions. The child's safety had to take precedence over all other considerations, including the complex politics of palace hierarchy. "Your Majesty," the captain said, his voice carrying new steel, "I am formally requesting that you release Princess Charlotte immediately. Her welfare is my responsibility as captain of the palace guard, and I cannot allow any member of the royal family to come to harm under my watch." His words were measured but carried the unmistakable weight of authority backed by years of respected service. Helena's face contorted with rage at this unprecedented challenge to her power. "You forget yourself, Captain. I am your queen, and you will obey my commands without question. Princess Charlotte is my stepdaughter, and I will discipline her as I see fit. Your interference ends now, or you will find yourself stripped of rank and expelled from this palace before the day is through." The threat hung in the air like a sword of Damocles, but Captain Thornfield had made his choice. Some principles were worth any sacrifice, and protecting the innocent was the most sacred duty of any true soldier. He took another step forward, his presence becoming more imposing as his military bearing asserted itself fully for the first time in years. Charlotte's desperate eyes met the captain's, and in that moment, he saw not just a princess, but a terrified child who needed someone to stand between her and harm. The sight strengthened his resolve beyond any possible doubt. "Your Majesty, step away from the princess. This situation has gone far enough, and I will not allow it to continue." The gathered palace staff gasped audibly at this direct confrontation between Queen and Captain. Several guards who had arrived began to position themselves uncertainly, torn between conflicting loyalties and unsure which authority they should ultimately obey. The very foundations of palace order were being tested in ways that had never been anticipated. Helena's response was swift and vicious. "Guards, arrest this insubordinate fool immediately. He has committed treason against the crown by threatening your queen." Her voice echoed through the corridors with imperial authority, but the expected immediate obedience did not materialize. The guards hesitated, looking between their captain and their queen with obvious confusion and distress. Captain Thornfield remained calm in the face of Helena's fury, his years of military service having prepared him for moments of extreme pressure. "Men, your primary duty is to protect the royal family. Look at Princess Charlotte and tell me she is not in need of protection." His words carried the weight of shared experience and mutual respect built over years of service together. The palace guards found themselves in an impossible position, their training and loyalty pulling them in opposite directions. Princess Charlotte's obvious distress and the captain's reputation for honor and integrity weighed heavily against their formal obligation to obey the queen consort. The pause stretched uncomfortably as they struggled with their decision. Helena's grip on Charlotte shifted as she attempted to drag the child away from the growing confrontation. "This discussion is over. Princess Charlotte and I are retiring to the upper chambers, and anyone who attempts to follow will be charged with treason." But her movement triggered an immediate response from Captain Thornfield, who had been watching for exactly such an attempt. "Stop!" The captain's command rang out with military authority as his hand moved to his sword hilt in a fluid motion born of decades of training. The ceremonial weapon cleared its sheath with a metallic whisper that seemed to freeze everyone in place. The sight of drawn steel in the palace corridors was so unprecedented that it took a moment for the full implications to register. Helena stared in shock at the naked blade pointing in her direction, her face cycling rapidly through disbelief, rage, and something that might have been fear. "You dare draw steel against your queen? This is treason of the highest order. You will hang for this insult." But despite her words, she had stopped her retreat and loosened her grip on Charlotte's arm slightly. Charlotte seized the moment of distraction to pull free from Helena's grasp, stumbling backward toward the safety offered by Captain Thornfield's protective stance. The child's liberation sent a visible wave of relief through the assembled staff, though the crisis was far from over. The drawn sword had escalated the situation beyond any hope of quiet resolution. "I draw steel only to protect the royal family from harm," Captain Thornfield stated clearly. his sword held in a defensive position that threatened no one but promised protection for Charlotte. Princess Charlotte is a member of the royal family, and she is clearly in distress. My oath requires me to ensure her safety above all other considerations. The standoff had reached its climax, with Queen Consort and Captain facing each other across drawn lines that could never be uncrossed. The ancient protocols of Ravenscroft Palace provided no guidance for such a situation, leaving everyone present to navigate uncharted territory, where careers, relationships, and possibly lives hung in the balance. Helena's eyes burned with fury as she realized that her authority was being publicly challenged in a way that could never be forgotten or forgiven. "This is not over, Captain Thornfield. You have made an enemy of the crown today, and you will pay dearly for your treachery. Guards, I command you to arrest this traitor immediately." Her voice cracked with emotion as she played her final card. The palace guards remained motionless, their internal conflict now resolved by the clear sight of Princess Charlotte's relief at being freed from Helena's grip. Captain Thornfield's reputation for honor and his obvious concern for the child's welfare had tipped the scales in his favor. Their loyalty to the crown included protecting all members of the royal family, even from each other. Charlotte had moved to stand behind Captain Thornfield, her small hands gripping the back of his uniform jacket as she sought security in his protective presence. The child's trust in him was absolute, and it served as a powerful reminder to everyone present of what was truly at stake in this confrontation. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting different shadows through the palace windows and illuminating a scene that would be remembered and discussed for generations to come. The careful balance of power that had maintained order in the kingdom had been shattered, and the pieces would have to be rebuilt from scratch. Helena stood alone now, her authority challenged and her actions exposed to scrutiny. The isolation seemed to strip away some of her imperial bearing, revealing the uncertainty and desperation that lay beneath her regal facade. The queen consort, who had demanded absolute obedience, now faced the consequences of pushing too far too fast. The drawn sword glinted in the sunlight streaming through the windows, its presence a stark reminder that some lines could never be uncrossed. Captain Thornfield maintained his protective stance, ready to defend Princess Charlotte against any threat, while the palace staff watched in fascinated horror as their ordered world transformed around them. The aftermath of Captain Thornfield's unprecedented action rippled through Ravenscroft Palace like wildfire. Word of the confrontation spread quickly among the staff, growing and changing with each telling, until the corridors buzzed with whispered conversations and shocked speculation. The sight of drawn steel in the sacred halls had shattered the comfortable illusion that palace life existed apart from the harsh realities of the outside world. Princess Charlotte remained close to Captain Thornfield, her small frame still trembling from the ordeal with Helena. The captain kept his sword drawn but lowered, a clear signal that he remained ready to act while hoping the crisis had passed its peak. His eyes never left Helena, watching for any sign that she might attempt to renew her assault on the child, or escalate the situation further. Helena's rage seemed to burn itself out as the reality of her situation became clear. The palace guards had not moved to arrest Captain Thornfield despite her repeated commands, and their continued hesitation spoke volumes about where their true loyalties lay. The queen consort found herself isolated and powerless in a way she had never experienced since marrying into the royal family. "This insurrection will not stand," Helena declared, though her voice lacked the iron authority it had carried earlier. "I will not be humiliated by servants and soldiers in my own home. There will be consequences for this betrayal that reach far beyond this palace." Her words carried the promise of future retribution, but the immediate threat seemed to have passed. Senior palace staff began arriving as news of the crisis reached the upper levels of the administrative hierarchy. Lord Chamberlain Westbrook, a man whose family had served the crown for 3 generations, appeared with his usual dignity intact despite the obvious haste of his journey. His experienced eyes quickly assessed the situation, taking in the drawn sword, the frightened child, and the furious queen consort. "Captain Thornfield," Lord Westbrook said carefully, "perhaps you might explain the circumstances that have led to this unusual display of arms within the palace?" His tone was diplomatic but carried undertones of serious concern. The Lord Chamberlain's primary responsibility was maintaining the stability and reputation of the royal household, and both were clearly at risk. Captain Thornfield straightened slightly but maintained his protective position near Charlotte. "Lord Westbrook, I found Queen Consort Helena forcibly restraining Princess Charlotte in a manner that appeared to cause the child significant distress. When diplomatic intervention failed to resolve the situation, I was compelled to take more direct action to ensure the princess's safety." The formal language could not mask the gravity of the accusation being made. Helena's treatment of Charlotte was now a matter of official record, witnessed by numerous palace staff and documented by the Lord Chamberlain's presence. The political implications were staggering, as any suggestion of abuse within the royal family could destabilize the entire kingdom. Helena stepped forward, her royal bearing reasserting itself as she addressed Lord Westbrook directly. "The captain has grossly misrepresented the situation. Princess Charlotte was being disciplined for her continued disobedience and lack of respect for royal protocol. Captain Thornfield's interference was unwarranted and constitutes a serious breach of palace authority." Lord Westbrook's experienced gaze moved between the three principals in the drama, noting Charlotte's tear-stained face and obvious fear whenever she looked toward Helena. The child's condition spoke more eloquently than any formal testimony, and the Lord Chamberlain's years of service had taught him to read the subtle signs of palace politics with deadly accuracy. "Princess Charlotte," Lord Westbrook said gently, kneeling down to the child's level. "Are you hurt in any way? Can you tell me what happened this morning?" His voice carried the warmth and patience that had made him a favorite among the younger members of the royal family throughout his long career. Charlotte looked up at Captain Thornfield uncertainly before answering in a small voice. "Stepmother Helena was very angry because I was reading in the library. She grabbed my arm very tightly and was dragging me somewhere. It hurt, and I was scared." The simple honesty of the child's account carried more weight than any elaborate explanation could have provided. The Lord Chamberlain rose slowly, his face grave as he processed the implications of Charlotte's testimony. The child's account corroborated Captain Thornfield's version of events and painted a disturbing picture of Helena's behavior. The political ramifications of the situation were beginning to crystallize in ways that could affect the entire kingdom. Helena's face flushed with anger at Charlotte's words. "The child exaggerates and seeks sympathy where none is deserved. I was simply ensuring she understood the consequences of her disobedience. Any marks on her arm are the result of her own resistance to proper correction." Her defense sounded weak even to her own ears, particularly given the number of witnesses present. Captain Thornfield finally sheathed his sword, the metallic sound echoing through the corridor as a signal that the immediate physical threat had passed. However, his positioning remained protective, and his attention stayed focused on Helena's every movement. The trust between Queen Consort and Captain had been irrevocably broken, and the consequences would reverberate throughout the palace hierarchy. "Lord Westbrook," Captain Thornfield said formally, "I request that Princess Charlotte be placed under the protection of the palace guard until this matter can be properly investigated. I fear for her safety if she remains under Queen Consort Helena's direct authority." The request was unprecedented but logical given the circumstances that had just unfolded. The suggestion sent shockwaves through the assembled staff. The idea of protecting a royal princess from another member of the royal family challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which palace life was built. Lord Westbrook found himself in the impossible position of having to choose between the Queen Consort's authority and the child's welfare. Elena's reaction was swift and venomous. "This is preposterous. I will not have my authority undermined by palace staff who forget their place. Princess Charlotte is my stepdaughter, and she will remain under my care and guidance as is proper and legal." But her protests lacked the commanding presence they had carried earlier, weakened by the obvious concern of the staff for Charlotte's well-being. Charlotte herself seemed to shrink at the suggestion that she might be returned to Helena's custody, moving even closer to Captain Thornfield's protective presence. The child's reaction spoke volumes about her level of trust in her stepmother, and Lord Westbrook could not help but notice the stark contrast in her behavior around different adults. The palace physician, Dr. W. Harrington, arrived as word of the incident reached the medical quarters. His trained eye immediately noticed the redness around Charlotte's arm, where Helena had gripped her, and his gentle examination confirmed the presence of bruising that would likely be more pronounced by evening. The medical evidence provided objective support for the child's account of events. Princess Charlotte shows signs of forceful restraint. Dr. Harrington reported quietly to Lord Westbrook. The bruising pattern is consistent with being gripped and pulled against her will. While not severely injured, the child has clearly experienced significant distress. His professional assessment carried the weight of medical authority and courtroom admissibility. The gathering of senior palace staff had grown as more officials arrived to assess the crisis. The unprecedented nature of the situation had caught everyone unprepared, and the lack of clear protocols for handling such internal conflicts was becoming increasingly apparent. The careful structures that governed palace life were proving inadequate for the human drama that had erupted in their midst. Helena found herself increasingly isolated as the evidence mounted against her version of events. The medical examination, Charlotte's testimony, and the witness accounts of numerous staff members painted a picture that was difficult to refute or minimize. Her position as queen consort provided legal protection, but could not shield her from the court of public opinion forming around her. The mourning that had begun with such promise for the kingdom had transformed into a crisis that threatened the very foundations of the royal family's reputation and stability. The ancient walls of Ravenscroft Palace had witnessed many dramatic moments throughout their long history, but few had carried such potential for lasting damage to the institution they sheltered. The crisis at Ravenscroft Palace had reached a turning point, as Lord Chamberlain Westbrook found himself facing a decision that would define the future of the royal household. The evidence against Helena's treatment of Princess Charlotte was overwhelming, but the political implications of taking action against a queen consort were staggering. The delicate balance of power that kept the kingdom functioning hung by the thinnest of threads. News of the confrontation had reached King Edward, who was returning from a diplomatic mission to a neighboring kingdom. His private secretary had sent urgent word through the fastest messengers available, but it would still be several hours before the king could return to address the crisis personally. In his absence, the palace staff found themselves navigating uncharted waters with potentially catastrophic consequences. Princess Charlotte remained under the informal protection of Captain Thornfield and the palace guard, though the arrangement existed in a legal gray area that could not be maintained indefinitely. The child seemed calmer now that she was safely away from Helena's reach, but the trauma of the morning's events was clearly visible in her subdued demeanor and reluctance to leave her protectors. Helen had withdrawn to her private chambers, ostensibly to compose herself but more practically to avoid the increasingly hostile atmosphere in the palace corridors. Her isolation was both physical and political, as even her most loyal supporters among the staff began to question her fitness for the role of queen consort and stepmother to the young princess. Lord Westbrook called an emergency meeting of the senior palace staff to address the immediate crisis and plan for the king's return. The unprecedented nature of the situation required careful handling to prevent further damage to the royal family's reputation, while ensuring Princess Charlotte's continued safety and well-being. The situation we face today has no precedent in our long history, Lord Westbrook began, addressing the assembled officials in the oak-paneled council chamber. We must balance our duty to the crown with our obligation to protect the innocent, all while maintaining the dignity and stability that the kingdom requires from its royal family. Captain Thornfield stood at attention as he provided his formal report of the morning's events. His military precision and evident concern for Charlotte's welfare impressed even those who had initially questioned his dramatic intervention. The captain's willingness to risk his career and reputation to protect the princess had earned him considerable respect among the palace staff. Dr. Jatpissa Harrington presented his medical findings, documenting the physical evidence of Helena's rough treatment of Charlotte with clinical precision. The photographs and written report would provide objective evidence should legal proceedings become necessary, though everyone hoped the situation could be resolved through internal palace channels. The legal implications of the crisis were complex and far-reaching. Helena's status as queen consort provided her with certain protections under royal law, but those same laws also required her to uphold the dignity and welfare of the royal family. Her treatment of Charlotte could be interpreted as a violation of her duties, potentially providing grounds for formal action. Palace security was quietly increased as a precautionary measure, with additional guards posted throughout the royal quarters and heightened vigilance around Princess Charlotte's movements. The threat was now internal rather than external, requiring a delicate approach that balanced protection with the need to avoid creating the appearance of a palace coup. Helena's supporters among the nobility began arriving as word of the crisis spread beyond the palace walls. The political ramifications of any action against a queen consort could extend far beyond the immediate royal family. potentially affecting alliances and power structures throughout the kingdom. The stakes continued to rise with each passing hour. Charlotte was moved to secure quarters in the palace's east wing, accompanied by trusted staff members, and under the constant protection of Captain Thornfield's most reliable guards. The arrangements were temporary but necessary, providing a safe haven while the adults worked to resolve the larger crisis surrounding her welfare. The young princess seemed to understand that something momentous had occurred, though the full implications were beyond her 8-year-old comprehension. Her trust in Captain Thornfield and relief at being away from Helena's anger provided clear evidence of where her sense of safety lay, further validating the captain's actions earlier that morning. Public relations specialists within the palace began preparing for the possibility that news of the incident might leak beyond the royal household. The damage to the monarchy's reputation could be severe if the story emerged without proper context and management, requiring careful preparation of official statements and responses. As afternoon approached, the tension throughout the palace remained high despite the absence of immediate physical confrontation. The underlying issues that had led to the morning's crisis remained unresolved, and Helena's presence in the palace continued to pose a potential threat to Charlotte's welfare and the stability of the royal household. King Edward's early return was announced by messenger, bringing both relief and apprehension to the palace staff. The king would have to make difficult decisions about his wife's future and his daughter's protection, choices that would affect the entire kingdom. The resolution of the crisis would require wisdom, courage, and a willingness to put the welfare of the innocent above political considerations. Captain Thornfield prepared his formal report for the king's review, documenting every detail of the morning's events with military precision. His decision to draw steel against the queen consort would require explanation and justification, but the captain remained confident that his actions had been necessary and proper under the circumstances. The ancient halls of Ravenscroft Palace had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties throughout their long history, but few moments had carried such potential for lasting change as this day's events. The confrontation between duty and authority, protection and power, had revealed fundamental flaws in the royal household that would require immediate and dramatic action to address. As the sun began its descent toward evening, the palace staff waited anxiously for their king's return and the resolution of a crisis that had shaken the very foundations of their ordered world. Princess Charlotte's safety had been secured for the moment, but the larger questions of justice, authority, and the future of the royal family remained to be answered. The transformation of a simple disciplinary matter into a palace-wide crisis demonstrated the fragile nature of the structures that governed royal life. The morning's events would be remembered and discussed for generations to come, serving as a reminder that true authority comes not from position or title, but from the moral courage to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Helena's fate remained uncertain as the kingdom awaited King Edward's judgment, but Captain Thornfield's actions had ensured that Princess Charlotte would never again face such treatment alone and unprotected. The sword drawn in defense of innocence had changed everything, and there could be no return to the way things had been before. The palace walls that had sheltered centuries of royal secrets now held a new story of courage, conflict, and the eternal struggle between power and righteousness. The legacy of this day would extend far beyond the immediate participants, influencing the future of the monarchy and setting new precedents for the protection of the vulnerable within the royal household. This concludes the 5-part fictional royal drama, exploring themes of duty, protection, and moral courage within a completely imaginary royal setting.